Good afternoon, or no, I should say morning. Welcome to Lifting Your Spirit, a monthly broadcast in which we interview people about their spiritual lives and how they support others in lifting their spirit. I'm Reverend Joel Grossman, Interfaith Minister, Director of Spiritual Services with Constellation Hospice here in Newburyport, and I also offer spiritual coaching virtually on a donation basis.
And I'm Ted Jones, a meditation teacher at North Shore Insight Meditation Center.
Our show is based on the following four principles. 1, everyone is spiritual. Sometimes we are conscious and active regarding our spiritual lives, sometimes not, but we always have a spirit.
There are many ways to lift your spirit, not only through religious practices, but also through nature, art, human relationships, and service to others.
Each person's spiritual path is unique and may change in small or large ways over time.
It's important to respect your own spiritual journey, trusting that one step leads to another, and also to respect other people's spiritual journey, regardless of how different it may be from your own. We're not here to convince you of the benefits of any particular method or approach. Rather, we're just offering food for thought.
And we have a very rich menu today. Good friend and associate, Jean Berman, is our guest. Jean has lived in intentional spiritual community and is now the director of volunteer services with Constellation Hospice. I got to know Jean as mentoring her in the CHIME program, Chaplaincy Institute of Maine Interfaith Seminary. So, Jean, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, Ted. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think I told you I've listened to all your previous shows, and I really resonate with what it is you're doing.
Great. So, as you know from listening to the other shows, that we always start off asking people to share about their spiritual journey.
Well, I will begin by telling you that when I was a youngster, like most youngsters, I would say, I was pretty selfish. I was really quite self-centered, and that continued into my teens. I did do some volunteering and some offering out, but I really thought of myself first, and I feel a little chagrined to think about some of my choices as a young person. And then things started shifting for me, so that there had been inklings, I'm sure, earlier. But I was in Madison, Wisconsin, and I identified myself at that time as an artist. And there were many women artists, and we had sort of a virtual community. We did a lot of work together. So this would have been in the 70s, probably the late 70s. And one woman did photography, I wrote poetry, I kept a journal, and I would read my journal, out loud at events when, I'd write something and then read it. And I did edible art shows as part of multimedia presentation, that sort of thing. And I got tuned in to my own fertility cycle as a woman. And that was a revelation to me. It was something that I had grown up not feeling very favorable about. But I saw how there is wisdom in the body. For example, we hear so much about PMS, premenstrual syndrome, and yet this is a natural time for women to go more inward, to take care of ourselves. And when we do that, then a lot of the challenges that women have during menstruation actually evaporate. So there's this cycle inherent in being a woman where we need to take care of ourselves. So I started tuning into that, and conversely, when a woman is in her fertile time, halfway through the cycle, typically, not always, but typically, has a lot of out there kind of presence. So ready to be a speaker or perform or so on, and then come back into this quiet time. And I think it's hard in our culture, the way things are now, because women are, I don't know how it is with men, but women are expected to always be like that fertile time, be present and on and so on. So as I explored this, and I explored this with other women, I began to feel a resonance with an understanding of some of the cycles of nature, the 4 seasons. I lived in Wisconsin, and there are definitely 4 seasons there, as there are here in Massachusetts. And there is a time, like now in summer when, it's a bit hot today, but there's a natural time for sort of being out there with people. And then in winter, it seems natural to draw in. Again, this is a generalization. But that was a spiritual awakening for me, to feel my own body and my own rhythms in connection with nature. I know you talk about being in nature as one of the ways that we lift our spirit, and that does seem to be fairly universal for people who are open to it. So that was, and one other thing I'll say about that, so much is said in spiritual circles about the light and the wonder of the light and the beauty of the light, and that light may be seen as love and divine energy and so on. This was more about the sacred darkness, more about being at peace in the darkness. If you think about it, when a child is conceived, it's in the darkness, and the child grows in the darkness. And you think of seeds in the winter quickening in the soil, under the soil, and so there's something that happens in the dark before coming out into the light. So I felt very at home in that way. I ended up living in the woods in northern Wisconsin for a year, and then I had this, what should I say? Well, first I'll tell you, my background is Jewish. And although I am an interfaith chaplain and minister, I do feel myself anchored in the Jewish tradition.
And did you grow up in a practicing household?
That's a good question, Ted. My father was very learned in Judaism, but it wasn't something that he forced on us. And actually, coming out of World War II, my parents were agnostic and anti-organized religion. So we did things at home. We had Passover and Hanukkah at home with my father's wonderful cantorial voice. And my parents were social activists. So for me, what I thought Judaism was about was the holidays and social activism. And I was very surprised when I learned more.
So I think you were about to say that you eventually found yourself in a community?
Well, yes. So how I got there, here I was in the woods. Something was about to change. I had been interested as in my early mid-20s of being a bridge between seemingly opposing factions, actually living as a bridge between. And one day I was in the woods and I got this message inside myself that my next bridging job was to be a bridge between what I called women's spirituality and Christianity, which I knew nothing about, really. I had friends who were Christian, but I didn't know very much about it. So shortly after that, I met someone who was an international representative for an organization called the Emissaries of Divine Light. And he listened to my journey of conscious development and said a few things that let me know that he understood what I had said and that there was more. For example, one of the things he said was, you had this experience, speaking to me, of feeling a oneness in nature. He said that oneness is in you, and nature reminded you of that. And the world needs you to be in it and have that experience, because we need that. So that was a challenge to me. And also some of the verbiage, which was somewhat Christian, was a challenge to me, but I'd had that kind of sensing. So I got involved in this organization and found myself over some time living at the international headquarters in Loveland, Colorado, at a place called Sunrise Ranch, which is the oldest still existing intentional community in the United States. It was started in 1945. And a big piece of why this community was started, and part of the message of the emissaries, had to do with being our real selves, our best selves. And there's nothing like being with others to both draw that out and to challenge it, right?
Yes.
So it was, this was to be a crucible and a proving ground, in a sense. And when I moved there, let me see, that was 1994. I was married at the time with a 3-year-old daughter, and there were 120 people living there. It was over 300 acres in the foothills of the Rockies, a 50-year-old organic garden, really quite an amazing place. And interestingly, it had gone recently with the death of the second leader of the organization from being hierarchical to being consensus-oriented. So if you've ever done any work with consensus, if you can imagine being in a room with 120 people trying to build consensus. So we went through a variety of different styles of governance, which, I learned a lot there. And one of the other things that drew me to that organization was they practice something called attunement. I know in Reiki there's something called attunement. This is a little bit different. This was a practice of seeing the endocrine glands as spiritual portals, not just for receiving, but for expressing, and to work with those and balance those. And that was very intriguing to me. And I became a practitioner and a teacher and a leader, and that was part of my love for being there in the community where I was for 16 years.
That process of attunement, was that seen as interpersonal or just something that you were trying to become in tune with in your own glandular system?
Good question, Ted. Both. There is a type of self-attunement For example, we had an exercise called Centering Your World, where in something of a meditative state, one would focus on the different circumstances and aspects of one's life as if held between the hands, and as if bringing love to that. And we had we had one saying which has stayed with me: "Let love radiate without concern for results." And that second part is so important. So just to be present, let the radiance from my connection with the source of life come around my circumstances. But typically we did this with another person. So we had a beautiful sanctuary there at Sunrise Ranch where people signed up for sessions. And we also worked with the chakras and the other body systems, the bones and so on. Did help, a range of health care, I would say.
Wow. So we were particularly interested in having you come this month because we're approaching the Jewish high holidays. So I'm asking you to take a big jump now from that to your present focus around Judaism and what the high holidays brings.
And how you got from one point to the other is very much of interest to me.
Thank you. So things changed again at the community, as any grouping of people, any one person, things are constantly changing. Life is so much about change. It went back to a hierarchical model, and I stayed as long as I could, and then it was time for me to leave. I had been involved in that organization for 30 years. That was the focus of my life, and so it was quite something to leave. My daughter had grown and left the nest, and my husband and I divorced. I like the word husband. It's much friendlier than ex. And I would say we both worked really, really hard to stay friends through the divorce, and that feels like a life accomplishment to me. At the same time that I was needing to leave, my mother died suddenly in Madison, Wisconsin. And so I had, at the time, it seemed like how could these big cycles, and I had just been divorced and recently been through breast cancer, how could this all be happening at once? But it worked out very well because it gave me a focus to go to my parents' home. My dad had been gone a long time, and to go through my parents' belongings and then get the house ready for sale and so on. So I went back and forth between Wisconsin and Colorado in the process of leaving the community. It also helped that my mother had left the three of us kids some money, because after 30 years in this community, I had $2,000. So then I gave myself a year off. I wanted to take some time. I traveled around in my little car around the U.S., visiting friends and family that I never had time or money to do. I took my daughter to Africa for 3 months on frequent flyer miles that I had saved for 30 years. And one of the places that I visited was Portland, Maine. I have 3 first cousins there who are brothers. And I loved Portland. And I came back to Portland nearing the end of my year when it was time to figure out where I was going to be, and somehow found the Chaplaincy Institute of Maine. And it was experiential, it was in person, it was for people of any religious or spiritual tradition or none, and there was one Jewish person involved, and that was Joel. So that helped me feel good about it. And my sister, who's a rabbi, felt good about it, that there was a Jewish person in this, because she had seen the more Christian orientation of the emissaries. So I got involved. That anchored me in Portland, Maine, the Chaplaincy Institute of Maine. And it was interesting that in the second year, I was interested in all different traditions. I love ceremony, and I love creating ceremony and ritual. And it was in my second year at the Chaplaincy Institute of Maine that I rediscovered Judaism. And it became much stronger in me at, 60-ish. So that was interesting. There was one thing I'll tell you briefly about Judaism, which follows the cycles of nature, the rituals, the holidays do. I had been involved in end-of-life care in the Jewish tradition. There's a ceremony called Tahara, which is an exquisite, respectful washing and blessing of the body of someone who has died. One of my most spiritual experiences is doing that work. So I had been connected with that. But getting back to the holidays, which you asked me about, so we're approaching what's called Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, the 10 days, starting with Rosh Hashanah and ending with Yom Kippur. So these days of awe, as I understand it, are an opportunity to refresh ourselves spiritually. There are three basic tenets. One is tefillah, which is prayer or oneness, awe, love, quiet in nature, whatever prayer means for an individual, to refresh that, to make that new. How is it that I connect with the source of life, with the divine? Tzedakah, which is often translated as charity, but I think of it more as giving of oneself. So how is it that I give of myself into the world? And teshuvah, which has to do with returning to my own real self, taking stock of my life in the last year, some of the choices that I've made. Were there times that I missed the mark, that I might need to ask for forgiveness for, that I might need to do community service for? Is there something that I want to do differently? Is there something that I need to let go of that no longer works for me? So those are the key elements that, from my perspective, Jews have the opportunity to really work with during those 10 days, and even this month leading up to the days of awe can be seen as preparation. And may I tell you about one ritual that is a part of the...
Please.
Yes. So there's something called tashlich. Tashlich has to do with running water, being by a body of water, and letting go. So one might turn their pockets inside out and toss whatever is in there. People used to throw breadcrumbs, but that's not so good for the wildlife. So people now throw stones or natural things, but it's a ceremony of letting go. This no longer serves me. This is something I did that I want to forgive myself for. This is something that someone else did that I want to forgive them for. This is a ceremony of letting go. And it can be done individually, but it also can be done as a group of people. And it's very precious.
Traditionally, synagogue after the service will go down in Newburyport here, go down to the Merrimack would the rabbi do it. But for 25, 30 years now, a group of us has been going at sunrise out to Plum Island and doing it there, and then doing Israeli folk dancing and singing on the beach. Then going and having bagels, and then go to synagogue.
That sounds delightful.
It's really good. I look forward to it every year. Yeah. And when you mentioned missing the mark,
Yes.
that's the translation of the Hebrew word for sin. So sin is not like you're such a bad person, you did something wrong. You missed the mark.
Yes. Yeah, and I've heard that same use of language in some Christian
Yeah.
teachers of sin really being a missing the mark, not something that you're judging yourself
Right.
harshly with. So that's interesting overlap there. I'm fascinated by your sister being a rabbi and how her journey may have influenced you in some ways. What is the nature of your relationship with her now, particularly during the holiday season, and how it seems like there's a lot of kind of different cross currents in your life that have really brought you to where you are now. So just that piece of it is very I'm very curious about.
And I'll throw in one more interest, how your life has influenced your sister's.
My sister and I are 11 years apart.
Wow, that's interesting right in itself.
There's a brother between us.
And who's the older of the two?
I'm the older.
Okay.
And I think that my sister was very influenced by my life as I was growing up and all the crazy things I did. She tempered her choices a little bit. And she's a Reconstructionist rabbi. So Reconstructionism is a progressive branch of Judaism. And I would say, along the way, she sort of spoon-fed me things that she knew that I would like. A book by Arthur Waskow, which had to do with the relationship between the holidays and the seasons and things that people could do in a grouping that were, not as much liturgically based or, had some liturgy, but were more new, I guess. And certain women's music and things like that. My daughter was born when I was 37, and my sister was 26. And somehow it seemed like they were the two sisters for a long time. They were like two peas in a pod. And when my daughter was 5 years old, she told me that she wanted religious education.
Wow.
So there I was in the emissary center. I was like, okay, great. She said, no, Jewish education. So I went to the local synagogue, and the president said a wise thing. She said, you do have to be a member for your daughter to attend religious school, but don't join for her. Find something for you. And it took me a while. It took a couple of years before I did. But then that was a beautiful coming into that, and my daughter willingly went to religious school. I remember once she had a teacher that she complained about every week. I said, well, I'd like for you to finish out the year, but you don't have to go back if you don't want to. She said, Mom, of course I'm going back. And it was her choice to have a bat mitzvah. And I learned a lot more about Judaism through that. And my sister was very much a part of that. And to bring things to current time, my sister has a congregation for whom she's a part-time rabbi in Pennsylvania, where
And then
she lives.
At what point did she become a rabbi? When did she start a rabbinical
I think
Process.
in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, not that long after you started with you said about 1990?
Was when I moved to the community, but I'd already been involved with the
Yeah, okay.
organization for
Yes.
15 years.
Okay, I
yeah,
got it.
yeah. So one of the blessings of the pandemic for me was that suddenly my sister was available on Zoom.
Yeah.
So my sister is the rabbi who I most closely resonate with. And very rarely have I had the opportunity to be at her services or at her classes. And now I can do both. And I could do both during the pandemic. And I still, to this day, there are wonderful congregations in Portland, and I belong to a couple of them. But I'd rather be with my sister.
Wow. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And beyond attending services, you lead a service once a month, right?
Yes. So this is something I've been doing for 10 years. One of the things I learned through the Chaplaincy Institute of Maine was the value of volunteering. I had done a little bit before then, but it was really something that became a focal point for me. And I started volunteering once a month at a retirement home in Portland, 75 State Street, wonderful, wonderful place. And so I started going there once a month on a Friday afternoon and doing a Kabbalat Shabbat, a welcome to Shabbat kind of abbreviated service, bringing, what I hoped was the essence to share with the people. And I've continued doing that. I do it now more on Saturday mornings. It seems to work out better. And that's still Shabbat, the Jewish day, starting when it begins to get dark and going overnight, and starting in the dark, as in the book of Genesis. First there was the dark and then the light, and we go into the light. Anyway, I do services now mostly on Saturdays, and there's a handful of people there, but it's so meaningful to me. And if there's one person there, I'll do the service, and it's really a special time.
So, as I mentioned in my introduction, we work for a hospice. So anything you'd like to say about your hospice work in relation to what you've been sharing in your spiritual life?
So, end of life is something that has been a real calling for me in one way or another for about 40 years, since my beloved cousin died by suicide. I didn't actively make the connection at that point, but it sort of found me over time. And I have been at bedside with people more in the past than recently. And Joel, you were the one who encouraged me to apply for a job as a chaplain with Constellation. I didn't get the job, but then there was a job opening as a volunteer coordinator. I've had that job for almost 5 years, and I love working with the volunteers. People who want to volunteer are special people. People who want to volunteer for hospice are very special people. So I have the opportunity to work with these tremendous people, Ted having been a volunteer with us for years. And I enjoy that, and I also have the opportunity to be part of the hospice team as part of our daily calls, our every other week meeting to talk about patients. So I miss the contact with the patients and their families, but I do really enjoy the work.
As one of the people who has been a volunteer under your supervision, you do a very good job with that.
Thank you.
And I was impressed by how you tried to bring different perspectives into the training of volunteers. I think I did a short thing at one point around Buddhist meditation, and I guess I'm curious about how your spiritual life, your spiritual practice, sort of informs how you approach your job, how you approach the whole subject of end of life, and because that's what we're working with in a hospice, and different spiritual traditions approach end of life somewhat differently. There's some commonality, but I'm wondering what it's like for you, because it's such a deep part of our spiritual lives. Is where are we going? What's going to happen when we're no longer on this planet in this form?
Interestingly, Ted, it's not something that I delve into with volunteers. There's some in the training about different people's perspectives. And there's some that I bring in when I talk with people individually or when we have a volunteer meeting. But I would say my style of teaching is more by doing, I guess. So one of the ways that I believe we can lift our spirits is by lifting one another's spirits, as you do with the show. And how do we do that? One of the ways is to see the best in the other person. Always look for the best. And so what I hope to model in my relationships with my volunteers is how they can be with the people who they see, the patients and the families who they interact with. I listen deeply to them, and there are a couple of things. I don't remember who said that, whatever your words are, people may remember your words, but what they really remember is how they made you feel.
Yeah, wonderful.
So I have in my mind to create an atmosphere of welcome and support and encouragement from the moment I talk with prospective volunteer all the way through to when there's someone right now as we speak who I think is likely sitting with a patient who is in the process of dying, to just be present, just listen, just really be with oneself. So how do people feel when they are with me? I try to pay attention to that, and I know there can be a difference between my intention and the impact it has on another person. So I try to be sensitive to that. And I think there's one other thing that's really important in interacting with other people. Actually, two things I'll say quickly. One is this idea that at some point, I heard this from Rudolf Steiner talk, at some point you will have the opportunity to see into the heart of another person. At some point in your acquaintance, hold that. When you think about them, when you interact with them, hold that. Their essence, the best that they are. And the other thing is to not have expectations that just because a person was this way one day, that they're going to be that way the next day. That's so for everyone. It's so for volunteers. It's so for patients. How much space do we give one another, especially if we know one another well, to change? Maybe you had an experience in the night and you woke up differently. Am I going to give you the space to show up differently in my life? Or am I going to say, well, Joel, that's not like you? So I think that's another important aspect.
Well, that's.
I can personally attest to Jean holding me in that way when I was giving her a hard time about something I was attached to. She said, "Okay, Joel, I hear you. I hear you do that very well."
Thank you. Thank you.
I love what you were saying. I mean, that it's seeing the best in people, and that you're modeling that in seeing the best in your volunteer staff, and that they can then bring that into the work that they're doing. And to some extent, that process is unspoken. It's just, as you said, the way you are. That I've always felt, I worked in the mental health field for 40 years, that there is an internal consistency in organizations where the way the management treats its employees is transmitted in the way the employees treat their customers or patients or whatever. And that I think you've summed that up very beautifully. I mean, I think that the job of an administrator or a supervisor is really to provide a supportive environment of respect, friendship, love, and it's wonderful the way you described it.
Thank you. And of course, I don't always live up to it.
Of course.
But I think opening an aperture for someone to shine.
Yes.
Don't we all need that?
Yes. Yes.
Well, you mentioned in going over the principles of high holidays and how we can approach them, return. It gets translated often as repentance, and I appreciate that you're on my wavelength, that more important than repent for something is to return to the beautiful selves that we truly are. And whenever I hear the word return, it takes me to a song by what I call the Holy Roller Rabbi, Shlomo Carback, this great guy, singer, performer, rabbi. And he wrote this beautiful, beautiful song that I'll share. Return again, return, join me.
Return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return to what you are, return to who you are, return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul.
So that's what we keep coming back to and keep going away from and keep coming back to. Yeah.
Very beautiful.
So, in so many ways, you've answered our closing question, but I'll just ask it once again. How can people lift their spirits?
I'm so glad we got to that. As I was thinking about this time, I was thinking that there are things that I do to lift my spirit in the moment, and then there are things that I plan to do. So in the moment might be listening to music, or going for a walk, or being in nature. Planning to do might be planning to go for a swim, or planning to spend time with person, or planning to do some watercolor or something like that. One of my teachers once said, an attitude of gratitude brings altitude.
Oh.
And that's a really quick way to lift my spirit.
We should include that in our bio about this show.
Sure.
That's perfect.
It's a good saying. What was I?
Sorry.
No, that's all right.
Ways to lift.
Yeah.
Suggested
Oh,
you to
thank
lift
you.
their spirits.
So another thing that the same teacher said was, and he had an acronym for it, but do something for someone quick. It brings me out of myself when I do something for someone. And maybe it's just a text saying, I'm thinking of you. Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's just even thinking about a person. Or maybe it's, doing an action, saying, I'm going to bring over this food that I made, to someone. That is an amazing spirit lifter. To do something for another person. And volunteering, I think, for people who are, who find themselves down a lot and maybe their world feels small, volunteering is a pretty amazing way to move through that. And may I share one other thing?
Please.
So in the time of this preparation for the Yamim Noraim, for the High Holy Days, I often take on a discipline that I do my best to do every day as a way of deepening my experience of Spirit. And what came to me this particular month is to experience my own self-care as a spiritual practice, as a way to connect me with the source of life. So, for example, I'm not just going to swim. I am aware of having this body, for which I am so grateful for, of the ability and the constitution to be able to stand the cool ocean. And to be in the ocean, this representation of the largeness, the vastness of the world, of holiness, of spirit, and to let this be an opening in myself to feel my connection with the divine. I'm alive. I have this body. Here's the ocean. I have sensation. It's so cold. It's so refreshing. I'm so renewed. I open my eyes in the ocean and it's like my own tears. It feels like my own body. So this has been an unexpected, wonderful new experience for me that is just deepening what I receive in my self-care. And self-care is vital to have our wells filled so that we can give to others, right?
Absolutely.
Sometimes people who have a spiritual orientation feel like I just have to give and give and give and not take care of myself. But if I don't take care of myself, at some point I won't have anything to give.
So true.
Well, that's a beautiful way to wrap up, and we thank you. Did you have anything?
No,
else?
I think that is a beautiful
Okay.
point to stop on.
So thank you so much, Jean, for all the richness you've brought to our interview today, and hope that people will take full advantage of your model of your life and your suggestions. And so we thank people for listening in, viewing, and we look forward to sharing with you next month again on Lifting Your Spirit.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I've enjoyed being with you both very much.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today, Jean.
Thank you, Ted.